Charlie Javice sold JPMorgan Chase a dream wrapped in student debt, venture capital language, and a spreadsheet full of fake people. She was the founder of Frank, a startup that promised to make the FAFSA, the federal student aid application, easier for millions of students. By her early 30s, Javice had been on Forbes lists, raised venture money, appeared on television, and positioned herself as the young founder who understood Gen Z finance better than the banks did. In 2021, JPMorgan wanted exactly that: access to young customers before they opened their first serious bank accounts, credit cards, investment apps, or loan products. Frank told JPMorgan it had more than 4 million users. That number was the heart of the deal. JPMorgan paid $175 million to acquire the company, but prosecutors later said the vast majority of those users did not exist. The customer list JPMorgan believed it was buying was padded with millions of fabricated student records. In 2025, a federal jury convicted Javice of fraud. It was a Silicon Valley growth story with a white-collar crime ending. Fake traction, fake data, fake scale, and a real check from one of the biggest banks in the world. Frank was launched around 2017 with a simple consumer pitch. College financial aid was confusing, FAFSA was tedious, and students needed a faster way through the bureaucracy. That pain point was real. Every year, millions of students and families deal with financial aid forms, grants, loans, deadlines, and eligibility rules. Frank marketed itself as a tool that could simplify that process. It charged some users fees for certain services, promoted itself as a student finance platform, and attracted venture investors who saw an obvious market: young people entering the financial system. Javice became the face of the company. She attended the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, fit the founder archetype investors liked, and told a story that sounded both public-spirited and highly monetizable. Frank was not just helping students, she argued. It was building a massive funnel of young consumers. For a bank, that mattered more than FAFSA itself. A student aid startup with a few 100,000 users might be interesting. A student aid startup with more than 4 million young users was a strategic asset. That was why JPMorgan cared. Under CEO Jamie Dimon, the bank had been pushing deeper into digital consumer finance, trying to compete with fintech companies that were capturing customers earlier and with smoother user experiences. Banks do not only want deposits, they want relationships that start early and last decades. A college student can become a checking customer, then a credit card customer, then a mortgage borrower, then an investor, then a small business owner. Frank seemed like a shortcut into that pipeline. In 2021, JPMorgan's Chase division evaluated Frank as an acquisition target. The bank wanted proof that Frank had the user base it claimed. According to the government's case, Javice repeatedly represented that Frank had more than 4 million customers or users when the real number was far lower. Reports and court filings described Frank's genuine user base as only a fraction of what was claimed, roughly in the hundreds of thousands rather than the millions. That gap was not a rounding error. It was the difference between a modest startup and a company worth $175 million to JPMorgan. The fraud, according to prosecutors, centered on what happened when JPMorgan asked for data. A buyer in an acquisition does not just listen to a founder's pitch, it wants evidence. Customer records, email addresses, names, dates of birth, addresses, school information, acquisition metrics, engagement data, and marketing performance all help determine whether the asset is real. Prosecutors said Javice knew Frank could not produce a legitimate list of more than 4 million users because Frank did not have one. Instead, she tried to manufacture the appearance of scale. The case included evidence that she first asked Frank's own director of engineering to create synthetic customer data. He refused, reportedly questioning whether the request was legal or appropriate. Then prosecutors said Javice turned outside the company. A data scientist was hired and paid to generate millions of fake customer records. The purpose was not innocent testing data or anonymized modeling. The purpose, the government argued, was to deceive JPMorgan during acquisition diligence. The fabricated list had to look real enough to satisfy a giant bank. That meant names, emails, phone numbers, addresses, and other fields that resembled a student database. Prosecutors said Javice and Frank's chief growth officer, Olivier Amar, worked to build or procure data that could fill the missing millions. Amar was also charged and later convicted. One part of the scheme involved a professor and data scientist who generated synthetic records. Another involved buying real consumer data from an outside list provider, including information associated with students or young people, to help make the database more believable. The fake data did not need to survive forever. It only needed to survive long enough to close the deal, and the deal closed. In September 2021, JPMorgan announced the acquisition of Frank for $175 million. Javice received millions from the transaction, including a large payout and a position at JPMorgan after the acquisition. Amar also received a substantial payout. The bank believed it had bought access to millions of young consumers. Instead, it had bought a company whose core growth claim was, in the government's telling, a mirage. The fraud began to unravel after JPMorgan tried to use the list it had acquired. This is where fake scale meets operational reality. A spreadsheet can impress in a data room, but marketing campaigns reveal whether the people are real. JPMorgan sent test marketing emails to Frank's supposed customers. The results were disastrous. Huge numbers of emails bounced. Engagement was far below what would be expected from a real user base. The bank started asking why a company with more than 4 million claimed users could not produce normal campaign performance. Internal scrutiny increased. JPMorgan eventually concluded that it had been deceived. In late 2022, the bank sued Javice in federal court, accusing her of inventing millions of customers to induce the acquisition. Javice denied wrongdoing and countersued, arguing that JPMorgan had fired her to avoid paying compensation and that the bank understood what it was buying. But the dispute did not remain a private civil fight for long. Federal prosecutors and the Securities and Exchange Commission moved in. In April 2023, Javice was arrested and charged by federal prosecutors in Manhattan. The criminal charges included conspiracy, wire fraud, bank fraud, and securities fraud. The SEC also filed a civil complaint. Amar was charged separately as an alleged co-conspirator. The government's case was straightforward in structure. Javice lied about the size of Frank's customer base, caused fake data to be created, used that data to deceive JPMorgan, and profited from the sale. The fact pattern was especially damaging because it included specific moments where the alleged deception had to be chosen. This was not a vague optimism case where a founder exaggerated market size or future growth. It was not merely a failed startup with aggressive projections. The allegation was that JPMorgan asked for customer proof. Frank did not have the customers, and Javice caused millions of false records to be created so the buyer would believe the company had scale. In white-collar cases, intent is often the battlefield. Here, prosecutors had emails, witness testimony, payment records, data files, and the sequence of diligence requests to argue that the intent was deception. The defense had to fight on several fronts. Javice's lawyers argued that JPMorgan was a sophisticated buyer with enormous resources, that the bank performed due diligence, and that the acquisition was driven by strategic motives beyond a raw customer list. They suggested that JPMorgan later regretted the deal and tried to turn a business dispute into a criminal case. The defense also challenged the meaning of users and the reliability of JPMorgan's own assumptions. In startup land, metrics can be messy. A user might mean a registered account, a lead, an applicant, an email subscriber, a customer, or someone who touched a product once. But prosecutors did not need to prove that Frank used imperfect terminology. They needed to prove that Javice knowingly caused false data to be passed off as real customer data. That is a much more concrete allegation. The government argued that there was no honest metric definition that could turn hundreds of thousands of real users into more than 4 million legitimate accounts. The fake records were the point. The trial ended in 2025 with a guilty verdict. A federal jury in Manhattan convicted Charlie Javice on charges tied to the JPMorgan acquisition, including fraud and conspiracy. Olivier Amar was also convicted. The verdict confirmed the government's theory that the Frank sale was not just startup puffery, it was criminal deception. The numbers made the case memorable. A 31-year-old founder, a $175 million acquisition, a claim of more than 4 million student users, and a real user base prosecutors said was dramatically smaller. The timeline also mattered. Frank rose during the late 2010s fintech boom, sold at the height of the 2021 deal market, collapsed into litigation in 2022, became a criminal case in 2023, and produced a verdict in 2025. That arc captured an era when venture-backed companies were rewarded for growth above almost everything else. Growth drove valuation. Valuation drove acquisition interest. Acquisition interest drove founder wealth. If growth was fake, the entire structure became a fraud machine. JPMorgan's role also deserves scrutiny, even though it was the victim in the criminal case. This was not a small local business fooled by a slick deck. JPMorgan Chase is one of the largest and most sophisticated financial institutions in the world, with lawyers, bankers, compliance teams, data analysts, and technology diligence processes. The fact that a fabricated customer list could help support a $175 million acquisition raised uncomfortable questions about how badly large companies wanted fintech growth stories in 2021. The bank did detect the problem after trying to market to the list, but that was after the money had gone out. This is one of the central lessons of the case. Diligence cannot stop at seeing data. It has to validate the source, test the data, and reconcile it against product reality. A list of names and emails is not the same thing as an engaged user base. A founder's charisma is not a control. A strategic narrative is not evidence. The more valuable a metric is to the deal, the more aggressively it has to be verified before closing. The Frank case is ultimately about the criminalization of fake traction. Startups often live in the future tense. Founders sell what a company could become. Investors accept uncertainty because the upside is supposed to compensate for risk. But there is a hard legal line between optimistic forecasting and fabricating historical facts. You can project that you will one day reach 4 million users. You cannot tell a buyer you already have them, then create fake records to back it up. That is why the verdict landed so heavily. It told founders, investors, and acquirers that growth metrics are not just marketing copy when money changes hands. They are representations with legal consequences. Charlie Javice built Frank on a real problem, found a real buyer, and secured a real $175 million exit. But the deal depended on millions of students who, according to the jury's verdict, were not real Frank users at all. In the end, the company that claimed to simplify financial aid became a case study in financial fraud. A founder selling access to the next generation of customers by inventing them.